which is our seller month. So last month we kind of focused on some of those buyer forms that we don't see as frequently or that, excuse me, we aren't as familiar with. So this month we're going to jump into some of those seller forms that I get a lot of questions on, or maybe not as familiar with it. Now we're going to talk about first the seller in possession form, which is when the seller remains in possession of the property after the close of escrow. Okay, so seller remains in the property after the close of escrow. We have forms for that. My favorite one, and this is what I recommend to everybody, is keep it less than 30 days. So 29 days or less, because then we use what's called a seller in possession form, a SIP form, versus our RLAS, which is our residential lease after sale. So if it's 30 or more days, we use the RLAS. If it's 29 days or less, we use the SIP form. The SIP form's a lot less official. It's a lot less scary. There's a lot of less that you have to know going into it. And it's only like 2 pages instead of like 300 pages, which the RLAS is. So I like the SIP. I recommend when possible that if we need 32 days that we just lengthen the close of escrow a couple days so that we keep that SIP less than 29 days. That would be my recommendation. You guys can do what you want. I don't know that I've got the RLAS on the schedule for this month because I'm really trying to push you guys to keep them all at 29 days or less. So, seller in possession. There's a new form that was released in June called the Seller in Possession Advisory. That's the form I have pulled up right now. I think this is really good because it talks about the risks to the seller in possession so that we no longer have to try to explain it to our clients of what they're taking on and what they're agreeing to. Because ultimately your buyers who are closing on the property are becoming landlords. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. So this is our SIPA form. So it goes in conjunction with the SIP form. I don't know why they didn't, well, I do know why they didn't put them together. I was going to say how I don't know why they didn't put them together. But ultimately, if somebody's talking about a SIP, I probably want to present this form to them first before they fully agree to the actual SIP. So I've got a buyer that has written or a seller who's asking for seller in possession. I'm going to include this with my disclosures so the buyer has to read and agree to it ahead of time. They know what they're agreeing to before they sign that SIP form. If I've got a seller asking for it, I may present this to my buyer right at that time when I'm talking about writing the offer of here's some things that you may want to pay attention to before agreeing to the seller in possession, right? Now, oftentimes we also need to advise our buyers that there's a solid potential if the seller needs to stay in possession of the property, whether it's 2 days, 3 days, a week, or a month after the close of escrow, and the buyer is unwilling to grant them that time, they may look for another buyer. Okay, so right. So there's always choices and risks, and there's a cost associated with every decision that we make. So our seller in possession advisory just talks about sellers for a variety of reasons may ask the buyer for permission to stay in the property after the close of escrow. Seller may need more time to finish packing, moving their possessions to a new location, and maybe looking to remain in the neighborhood for a certain period of the year, or they may be waiting for the replacement property to be ready to move in, whatever the case may be. Buyers and sellers who allow such arrangement face risk, right? So we talked about this back at the beginning of July, but we'll just cover it again. Number one, we're creating tenancy under California laws, right? So they may create tenancy because you've got now a tenant landlord situation. And if the seller remains, which is why we have a SIP form versus an RLAS, right? 29 days or less, 30 days or more, because a seller who remains in the property for 30 days or more are going to be given tenant rights, which means that if they don't vacate that property, it's things like a notice to vacate of 30 days, right? So they start falling under tenant laws. It becomes a lot more complicated. So just kind of keep in mind what happens there. Also, you have to comply with the applicable laws as far as making sure they get their deposit back. If they don't get the deposit back, all the written notifications that have to happen in a timely manner and all of that. So That's why we recommend 29 days or less, right? Because there's less legalities that fall in that range. Property damage is 2B. If the property is damaged during the occupancy, the parties will have to determine who is responsible for repairing the damage. These obligations may shift depending on whether the tenancy has been created. For a seller, continued occupancy of 29 days or fewer. Car form SIP, seller license to remain in possession. Makes the buyer responsible for damage or destruction that is not caused by the seller and that is out of the seller's control, regardless of who the agreement makes responsible for damages. It may be difficult to complete repairs in a timely manner or collect funds from the responsible party. And the deposit that we keep, which we'll talk about in a minute on the SIP form, is not for damages. That's a possession fee. So keep that in mind. Okay. Seller remains longer than agreed, right? Buyer will have to consult the local landlord tenant attorney to determine the lawful process to remove the seller. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, I've never had a seller remain longer than has been agreed to, especially with a SIP in place. I've always had them move out on time. That doesn't mean that they will. But oftentimes, too, when I'm agreeing to a SIP, I'm looking for the seller to have a defined end thing that happens. They've got a house they're moving into, they've got a new construction build that's being completed, they've got a move date to be PCS to a new location, whatever that is. I'm not just like, sure, seller, remain in possession with the hopes that you find a rental. It would be, oh, your rental's not available until the 25th. Perfect. We'll agree to that. But I'm really careful to maybe not just like open-ended time frame of the seller doesn't quite know what they're doing at the end of this yet, because I'm always a little bit more nervous that those are going to end in destruction. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. Consideration and legal restrictions, right? Buyers advised to seek legal counsel about any additional restrictions or issued related to the amount of consideration received. The amount received may be impacted by local or state rent control limits as well as current state of emergency. Additionally, settling an amount too low or even free of charge may have future impacts on buyer if seller remains longer than the agreed upon period. We'll talk about that as well when we get over to the SIP. I always recommend stating what it's going to be, even if part of it's going to be free, but we'll talk about that. Negotiating the terms of the seller in possession. Everybody has to mutually agree to add terms to the purchase agreement to allow the seller to remain in possession after the close of escrow. They're advised that such decision will have legal and financial consequences and will require careful consideration. A simple term inserted into the purchase contract declaring seller may remain in possession after the close of escrow for X days does not adequately address the many rights and obligations of the parties, which should be addressed and clarified. For seller continued occupancy of 29 days or less, that would be the SIP form, and 30 days or more would be the RLAS form. Okay, and if you are going to do the RLAS form, highly recommend giving them the RPOA form, or the Rental Property Owner Advisory form. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. Timing issues, the length of continued occupancy. To avoid ambiguity and confusion, the agreement must specify the length of the seller's post-close occupancy. Both SIP and RLAS agreement allow the parties to specify a certain number of days after the close of escrow or a set date for which they must vacate. We have our 29 days or less, 30 days or more. We've already talked about that. Seller's early departure. Okay, if the agreement allows the seller to remain in possession for a period of up to 29 days, that's the SIP form, then the default provision, keep this in mind in case you have buyers, state that if the seller leaves before the end of the specified time period, the seller will not receive a refund. So if they agree to pay $10 a day for 20 days, that's $200. And if they leave on day 10 and it's not specified anywhere else, the buyer still gets that whole $200, even if the buyer leaves sooner. If it's the RLAS, the seller will be obligated for the term of the agreement, or if it's month to month, seller must give 30-day written notice. So just kind of keep those in mind. Lender issues. This is important for our buyers to know that we need to seek the approval of the lender before it's signed, because some lenders limit or restrict the amount of time a seller can remain in possession after the close of escrow. So it's usually like 30 to 60 days. is when the buyer has to take possession of that property for it to be considered owner occupied. If you've got a investor making a purchase, it's usually not a big deal there if they're using a loan and doing an investment, investor loan or a second home loan, something like that. Security for damage. Buyers typically ask for a security deposit or a holdback to be applied in the event the seller damages the property after the close of escrow or fails to vacate on the agreed date. However, obtaining a security deposit may create a landlord-tenant relationship, and escrow holders may not hold a deposit after the close of escrow. If no rent or possession fee is charged for seller's continued occupancy, a security deposit is paid. There could be legal consequences concerning the maximum amount of security deposit that is allowed. Therefore, amount of any deposit, what it is called, how it will be held after the close of escrow, and the propriety of having such a deposit should be discussed with the buyer's local landlord-tenant attorney before signing the agreement. Let's see, we've got final verification of property condition. Buyer under California Residential Purchase Agreement has the right to conduct a verification of condition. That would be our buyer walkthrough. The final verification is not a contingency. Instead, its sole purpose is for the buyer to confirm that the seller has complied with the specific contract obligations, that it's maintained pursuant to paragraph 7B of the residential purchase agreement. That's right, basically in the same condition as of the date the offer was accepted. Repairs, alterations, replacements, or modifications have been completed as agreed. That would be anything agreed to on the residential purchase agreement. Seller has complied with the seller's obligations regarding the condition of the property under the agreement, and final verification is important even if the seller will be remaining in possession, because condition of property at close of escrow will help determine if the seller is entitled to a return of the security deposit or possession fee after the seller vacates. So just so everyone knows, when I do the verification of property condition, we'll skip on to that in a minute, but my buyer still should do a verification of property condition before the close of escrow when it's contractually allowed per the residential purchase agreement. Now, if the property is in the condition that it was supposed to be in, as if we were closing and buyer was going to take possession of it, what I normally note too is seller to remain in possession of property after the close of escrow. A final verification will be completed after seller vacates, right? So I do my final verification then, and then I make a note that the seller's remaining in possession. That way it's just contractually noted all the way through that is going to be the process. Regardless of whether seller is remaining in possession after the close of escrow, buyer should exercise his or her rights conducting the walkthrough prior to the close of escrow. The parties agree the seller to remain after close. Buyer should repeat that process when the seller moves out. It is advised that both seller and buyer photograph or video the property to confirm its conditions at both times. Okay, so we may want to advise our buyers of that, highlight that to let our buyers know that they may want to do that when they do their final verification. If the buyer wishes to make a claim to any funds being held as security or pursue the seller for damages, the buyer should conduct a walkthrough inspection both near the time of closing and upon seller vacating the property. And depending on the nature of the occupancy, buyer may be required to do so under law. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's something that the buyers probably should be advised to do. Insurance, liability coverage, and concerns. Seller's insurance consultation. Before signing the agreement, seller should consult with an insurance broker regarding policy coverage after the close of escrow. These issues include loss or damage to seller's personal property and vehicle located on the premise, seller's liability for damage to the property, and seller's liability for injury and damage to the person, property, guests, third parties, while seller retains possession of the property. Now, keep in mind, the property has closed. It is now the buyer's property. The seller is there as a tenant. If the house burns down, it's going to be a claim on the buyer's insurance, not the seller's. A lot of times our sellers just leave their insurance in effect through their possession. They should actually be calling their insurance broker and moving it over to a tenant or a rental insurance policy. Okay, making sure these things are taken care of. That if there's damages while we're there, if the property gets damaged and it's my fault, that's covered. Buyer should also talk with their insurance, because their insurance goes into effect the day that it closes, but it's a homeowner's policy, not a landlord policy. Okay, So they want to make sure that it's going to be covered in case somebody else damages that property during the term of that seller in possession. So just kind of keep in mind that they may need an additional rider or a temporary, or the insurance carrier may say, yep, it's taken care of, but they should check. Parties are advised to seek the advice of a qualified California landlord-tenant attorney who is familiar with the law for where the property is located, and a qualified CPA or tax professional before signing the agreement, allowing the seller to remain in possession after the close of escrow. We, the broker or agent, cannot give legal or tax advice. Unless otherwise agreed, the agency relationship with the broker or agents representing the parties in a purchase transaction is terminated, and the buyers or agents are not acting as property managers upon the close of escrow. Any questions about this advisory, the seller in possession advisory? Oops, I scrolled too fast. We'll find it. Sellers. And I do also have the chat box open, so you guys can always throw your questions in there as well. And don't hesitate to interrupt me if you're like, wait, stop, go back. Okay, but that's our seller in possession advisory. Again, this one should go out first before we sign the SIP, right? So anytime we're starting to write an offer on a property that has requested a seller in possession, this form should go to our buyer. We should make sure if our sellers are thinking about doing this, that they get it when we sign that residential listing agreement, okay? Seller in possession advisory, SIPA. They make it easy. It's the same form with an A because it's got an advisory. All right, let's talk about the seller license to remain in possession addendum. This is our SIP form. Okay, again, this is for 29 days or less, because once we hit that 30-day, it now triggers additional legal issues. Okay, fill out this top section in its completeness. This addendum is intended to grant the seller a license to remain in possession of and use the property after the close of escrow. It's intended for short-term occupancy. That's 29 days or less. If it's going to be 30 days or longer, you need to execute the RLAS form regardless of length of time of possession. Buyers advised to consult with a California qualified landlord attorney and discuss whether possession could be interpreted as creating landlord-tenant relationship between buyer and seller. And then we've got local rent control, right? Close of escrow. Okay, because I get this question a lot too. Close of escrow becomes day 0 for the purpose of counting days for the term of this license to remain in possession. Okay, day 0. The term, seller is granted a license to remain in possession for X number of calendar days after the close of escrow is the default. We're going to fill in a number here. It could be 15, it could be 26, it could be 2, it could be 5, it could be 29. It cannot be 32. Okay, if we say 32, you need to switch to the RLAS. Okay, or if we want a specific date, we could come over here, click this box, and then we're going to click here and pick a date. Again, this has to be 29 days or less, with the close of escrow day being day 0. Notice here, it gives us the date until 6 p.m. on that day. Okay, so whether it's calendar days or blank, the default is 6 p.m. They've got the whole day. So if you wanted them out in the morning, we would want to put like 10 a.m. or 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. or whatever it is there. Okay, so if we want to change that time, otherwise default is 6. Seller has no right to remain in possession beyond the term and may be responsible for court-awarded damages if seller does remain. Now, this next section is consideration. That's, hey, what's the seller going to pay to stay there? Okay, in consideration, the seller agreeing to sell buyer and buyer agreeing to allow seller to remain in possession after the close of escrow. Seller agrees to pay buyer non-refundable license fee for the term specified in paragraph 1 of blank dollars per day or blank. Okay, this traditionally, I know a lot of you are newer agents and you haven't been around a super long time, but back in the day when it was a full buyer's market, what we put in here is we would put in the buyer's PITI amount. That's their principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. So we would go ring, ring, lender. What's going to be the buyer's new payment for this purchase based on their current interest rate? And they would say it's going to be $3,200, including their taxes and insurance. And you're going to be like, cool, I'm going to take $3,200. I'm going to divide it by 30 because there's 30 days in a month. We always prorate based on 30, even if there's 28 days in the month or 31 days in the month. We prorate by 30. That's how we do things in real estate. And that's $106.67. So I'd put $106.67 here per day. Okay. And notice up here, we're going to come back and we're going to switch to this. We're going to say they're staying 10 days after the close of escrow. Okay. So what the escrow holder is going to collect, we're going to take that 106.67. Oops, hold on. 106.67 times 10. What did I put? 10 days. I don't know why I had to do the math for that. It's $166.70. Escrow is going to hold those funds and either distribute it to our buyer or keep it in escrow. I'll tell you what they're going to do here in a minute. Okay, so that's how that works. Now, we could put on here, we could do an addendum. Here's other conditions, terms. Right down here, we could put the first 5 days are at no cost to seller, right? So if we want to make some of it free, we want to make all of it free that they're staying, like 29 days at no cost to seller, but it's still in the buyer's best interest to specify a number up here, whether it's a flat amount per month or whether it's a per day, and it could be PITI, it could be just like pick a number off your head, like $100 a day, right? Whatever that is, we still want to pick that even if we're giving the seller the free, because as we learned in that advisory, if we say, hey, the seller's going to remain at no cost, seller decides seller's not moving out when seller's supposed to move out, we don't have any cost that the sellers agreed to pay per day outside of the original agreement, which makes it hard to go after them for damages or whatever. There's no amount there. So I would always specify like a per diem amount or amount per month. And then I would come down here and clarify whatever the free time is. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. This way we have something to go after the seller for when they don't move out. Again, I've never had a problem with the seller moving out, but it will happen at some point. I've had sellers threaten to not move out. All right, so we're going to specify that. Now, here's this next thing. At close of escrow, all consideration will be released to the buyer, or is it going to be held in escrow? Now, most of the time when we do this, I kind of like this per diem or whatever it's going to be that is collected from the seller because it's supposed to be non-refundable. I like it to be just released to the buyer so they have it to pay their mortgage payment when it comes due. Now, the other thing with a seller in possession is, let's say that we close escrow next week on August 15th, and then the seller is going to remain in possession through the end of the month until August 31st. Okay, and then my buyer's like, yeah, but then I've got to keep my apartment, and what if they're not out? And then I've got double payments. Well, here's the deal, buyers. When we close escrow on the 15th, they're going to pay their interest from August 15th through August 31st as part of their closing costs. Okay, that's factored in as closing costs. Then what happens is August comes, we already paid that interest, we prepaid that interest. September 1st starts. They do not have a mortgage payment on September 1st. What's going to happen now is September 1st, their interest is going to start accruing on the new loan for the house they just closed on August 15th. It's going to accrue until September 30th, at which point they're going to get a new mortgage statement for October 1st. So if we close mid-August, their first payment isn't going to be until October 1st. Okay, they've got a whole month of no payment there. Okay, which is nice if they move in, because now they've got like some extra funds potentially to like buy those things they forgot to buy when they were buying a new house. They didn't know they needed bath mats or shower curtains or their stove quits, whatever it might be, right? They've got some funds available. If we're doing seller in possession and we're giving the seller free rent back till the end of the month, they aren't going to have two payments on October 1st. And you can always check with their lender on when's their first payment going to be based on our close of escrow date, because the lender can tell them, but that's generally how it works. At close of escrow, we pay the interest for the month that we're closing in. Then interest accrues over the next month, and then they get their first payment the next time. Okay, so that's kind of how that works. All right. So anyways, most of the time, assuming there's no clause in here that any amount of those funds might go back to the seller, I would just release them to the buyer. If we're going to put a clause in here that, like if I'm drawing up for my sellers, oftentimes what I do is I draw up this seller in possession form and I include it in my HomeLight listing management file with my disclosures because I want it to be the terms the sellers are comfortable with. I don't care about the buyers, right? So I might put that in there that, hey, we get 10 days. The first 5 days are at no cost to seller. And then I would put here if seller moves out, or I'm going to put vacates property, P-R-O-P-E-R, property sooner than agreed date. You could even put, we're just put date in, let's see, section 1. We're just going to go date in section 1, then prorated amount to be returned to the seller upon vacancy. Right? And then I could take this and I could say, hey, we're going to copy this here. We're going to go copy. We're going to come over here to our clauses. We're going to hit create a clause. I'm going to paste that in there and we're going to call this our SIP clause. SIP seller clause. Save. Now that's in there. So at any time I can just click on this, hit add clause and pull that in, right? So right now how this is written is, hey, we're going to get 10 calendar days after the close of escrow. It's a charge of 106.67 per day, but the first 5 days are free. So at close of escrow, title and escrow is going to hold $533.35, okay, from the seller's proceeds to cover the difference for which they have are being charged. And then this form default is that excess money goes back, stays with the buyer, but I've written it in that the prorated amount goes back to the seller. So as long as everybody agrees to that and signs this form, what would happen is if my sellers moved out at 5 days instead of 10 days, they would get that $533 back. Okay, does that make sense to everybody?
See.
Okay, so in this case, what I would do is I would check this box here. Hey, I want it held in escrow because I don't want to try to get funds back from a buyer. I want to get those funds back from title and escrow. Everybody still has to sign to release those, but I think it's going to be a little quicker process than getting a check back from the buyer. So I usually check this box here that instead of it being released to the buyer, it's going to be held in escrow. Okay, because right here it states if seller vacates prior to the end, no portion or consideration will return, but we wrote it in that it will be. So that's the case where I would say, hey, no, let's hold it in escrow. Okay, now down here 2B is late charge, NSF, which is non-sufficient funds checks. If any payment from the seller to buyer is required outside of escrow and such payment is not received buyer within 5 days after due date, seller shall pay to buyer an additional sum of blank as a late charge, right? It might be $100. It could be $25. There's caps on that depending on where you're at. So just kind of keep that in mind, what that late charge can be. I think because we keep it under 29 days, we don't fall underneath that tenancy regulations, but we may just want to double check. So it might not have a cap there. If a check is returned in SF non-sufficient funds, seller shall pay to buyer $25 at an NSF charge. That is the max allowed by California state law for the first non-sufficient funds. Seller and buyer agree that these charges represent fair and reasonable estimates of the cost buyer may incur by reason of seller's late or NSF payments. Buyer's acceptance of any late charge or NSF fee shall not constitute a waiver as to default by seller. So always fill something in there, even if we're taking the payment through escrow. Just make sure it's that way. If the seller says, hey, can I get another 10 days, right? We're on day 8 and they're like, man, we're trying to get out of here. The house just isn't ready. Can we stay a few more days? And the buyer's like, yeah, no problem. So now we've extended this from 10 to 20 days. So now that seller is supposed to pay that fee outside of escrow for that extension. Seller fails to do so, now we have a late fee or a non-sufficient funds fee for something that happened. Even if we're not intending to do funds after the close of escrow, still fill that in case something happens, and there is. Our goal here is to protect people. Seller's obligations for the condition of the property maintenance. Seller shall make reasonable efforts to maintain the property, including pool, spa, landscaping, and grounds, and all personal property included in the sale. And substantially, the personal property, that'd be like your refrigerator, right? Technically, your stove, a shed that got left behind, whatever was included as part of the purchase agreement. In substantially the same condition as on the date of acceptance of the agreement or as modified by the agreement. However, seller shall not be responsible for any latent defects or any damage or destruction that is not caused by the seller, that is out of control by the seller. Pipe starts leaking in the wall, that's not the seller's responsibility. They had no control over the pipe inside that wall. Okay. Let's see. Buyers advised to obtain homeowners insurance to cover any damages that may occur after the close of escrow, and consult with the insurance agent regarding coverage in light of this license for seller to remain in possession. Except as provided in the agreement, seller shall not make any alterations to the property without buyer's written consent. 3B is delivery of possession. Seller shall deliver the property in the condition and on the terms provided in the agreement. That's the residential purchase agreement. C is our delivery of possession fee, right? This is what keeps us safe because it's a delivery of possession fee, not a security deposit. So keep in mind there, that's important. In addition to the license fee specified in paragraph 2, seller agrees to deposit with escrow holder or such funds shall be withheld from seller's proceeds a delivery possession fee in the amount of blank dollars. Okay, so this usually, like, think about what that should be. Oftentimes, like, you know, like $3-ish thousand, right? Somewhere in that range. Sometimes 1,000, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 5. It depends on the house. It depends on the situation, depends on the length of stay, right? But fill something in there. This money gets held. We want it to be a little painful to the seller if they fail to move out on time. That's what this delivery of possession fee is. Okay, this fee will be released to buyer. This one, I normally check the box that we're going to hold this in escrow. I know our buyers are really responsible and they would never spend money that's not theirs, but they forget what's theirs and what's not theirs. And if it goes back to them at the close of escrow with their refund of overpayment of closing costs, with their seller in possession per diem amount, right? Whatever that is, they're going to forget that this money has to go back to the seller. So I like to keep this money held in escrow. That's my preference. Okay. I think it's just better that way. It helps everybody manage their money a little bit better. I like to help people. Amanda, did you have a question?
Yeah. Uh, did I hear you right when you were saying that that money's held is not to be going towards damages?
Correct.
So how does that get resolved if there is damages? Because I do have something going on right now where it's like it wasn't disclosed, but it also wasn't inspected, and it was on a garage that's a separate, it's not attached to the house, so there's like, discrepancies there, and now it's broken, and my clients are like, what's going on?
So, number one, we would need to identify whether it was broken the entire time, it was just never inspected, and whatever. Was this something that was just the entire time and the buyers failed to inspect something and didn't realize it until after the sellers moved out, right? So we have to determine that this actually happened during the either the escrow period after contract was accepted, right? Whether it was when the seller was remaining in possession or whether it was during the contract period really doesn't matter if there was damage done to the property that wasn't disclosed. Okay, so assuming that it wasn't just always like that and buyers just never noticed it, assuming that it was actually broken during the escrow period or when the sellers were still in possession, we would need to have a conversation with the listing agent and potentially the sellers as to what the cost is going to be to repair that and if they're willing to do that or not. This fee is delivery possession. As long as they moved out on time, technically they get this fee back. Now, we can say the seller may be like, yeah, we broke it during the escrow period. We did fail to disclose that to the buyers. We're really sorry. We'd like to leave them a credit of $300 to get that repaired. we think that's what it's going to be. Buyers like, yeah, that's fine. It can be withheld from these funds, but the buyer themselves can't say, oh, we're only returning $2,700 to you instead of 3,000 because of these repairs were required or this damage to the property, because that was never the intention of these funds. Now, the buyer's other ramifications for that is to take them to small claims court, assuming that it falls within the bounds of small claims court. If it's a bigger damage than that, then we would take them through arbitration and mediation and into agreement that way to reach a resolution. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and tell me this too, because what if it was broken during the rent back period?
Then it still wouldn't get held from these funds because this is a delivery of possession fee, ensuring that the seller actually vacates on time. It would be the same thing. It would be, hey, seller, you broke this. It says that you were responsible for that. So we need you to repair that. So call out the repairman to come out and fix that. You're going to be responsible for that cost. Or my buyer is going to call out the repairman and be responsible for the cost. We're going to send you the bill. And if you refuse to pay it, then we'll have to take you to small claims court. Or we got a quote to fix it and it's going to be $300. And instead of releasing the whole 3,000 back to you, we could release $2,700. If you guys are agreeable to that, we'll just take the money from those funds. Is everybody in agreement on that? But we can't actually hold these funds based on that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
Amy, I have another question that's
Yeah.
really related.
Yeah.
Well, kind of, not really. My clients just closed on a property Monday. They moved in on Monday. Water heater went out on Monday. Seller is saying that it was working before she left, which I doubt, that it just stopped working like the day my clients moved in. So is that like they tried contacting the home warranty. They said, well, it was they couldn't say that it had been working because they had just moved in. And so, I mean, the seller's not liable for it anymore because we're closed, right?
Yeah, I mean, right. So buyer did inspections, water heater was working. There are things that happen at close of escrow. It, this is the problem with home warranties, right? Because it becomes a pre-existing condition. So we say, oh, we'll do this, but then close of escrow happens and then something stops working because inevitably it does. In this case, a water heater, whether it was a couple days before or the day of, who knows? And then home warranty says pre-existing. So this is a good reason that oftentimes, like in my purchase contracts, I write in home warranty with seller's coverage. Because if we write in that seller's coverage, it costs like $35 for the term of the escrow. Now there's no longer a pre-existing condition. All that stuff is covered. So that's one way to protect yourself in the future. This one, yeah, I mean, if the seller says, yeah, it was working during the inspections, it's going to be hard for the buyer to prove that the seller knew it wasn't working or it stopped working 2 days prior to close of escrow. They're going to be hard pressed to make that happen. And ultimately, it just becomes the responsibility of the buyers.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. This has been just that my pain in the butt transaction. It's those one clients I was telling you.
Um,
I'm like, now this? Oh my gosh.
You could call the rep for the home warranty, right? This is why who we choose for home warranty really does matter in making sure we have good relationship with the rep for that home warranty company. Because oftentimes if we explain the situation to our home warranty rep, they can usually push it through and get it covered if it should be covered. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. That's always an option, is to call that rep for the home warranty.
Okay. Yeah, I sent her an email earlier today. So what she says.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. All right. Now keep in mind here, it does say in this paragraph, within 5 days of the delivery of possession to buyer was going to return the delivery of possession fee to seller if the property is delivered to buyer in the conditions specified in paragraph 3A and B and on the date specified in paragraph 1. So you can potentially hold that deposit, potentially, for the damage that was done to the property during the rent back period. And If it becomes a big issue, I would just release it um, and then take them to small claims court. But you can, most of the time when I've had any damage that has happened during the rent back period, the sellers have fully agreed to allow some of those funds to remain. It hasn't been an issue, but you always need agreement. And it is a delivery of possession fee, not a security deposit. So just something to keep in mind there.
I have a question about that, the
Yep.
small claims. Isn't there a certain amount that it needs to be?
It
Do you
needs
know
to be under, I think it's $5,000 to go to small claims court.
Oh, so anything over is what?
Is a regular lawsuit, which then falls under the arbitration and mediation guidelines.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Utilities, seller agrees to pay for utilities and related utility services except for the following, right? Entry, seller shall make property available to buyer for the purpose of entering and making necessary repairs or supply necessary agreed to services or to show property, prospective or actual purchasers, tenants, mortgagees, lenders, appraisers, and contractors. Necessary repairs and service include but are not limited to repairs and services requested by buyer's lender or insurer. Buyer and seller agree that 24 hours notice, oral written, shall be reasonable and sufficient notice. In an emergency, buyer may enter the property at any time without prior notice. Buyer may not move personal property into the property without prior written consent from the seller. So, right? So general terms that you'd find in any lease agreement, 24 hours notice for the buyer to access. But they can, if you've got a investor that purchased the property to rent it out, they can show it to tenants during the seller being in possession of that property. And you can start having repairs done. Now, my recommendation to buyers is like, if we're moving into that property, we're getting floors redone, a roof redone, just wait until the seller moves out. It's just rude otherwise. Don't be rude. And most buyers are agreeable to that. You're not trying to make the seller's life miserable. If we were trying to make the seller's life miserable, just don't agree to the seller in possession. Keys and other items. Seller shall provide keys and other items necessary to access the property as required in the agreement at close of escrow. Or if we check this box here, then it would be at the end of the term. I usually check this box just so, like, we usually leave keys in the lockbox. Seller keeps the rest of the keys until they actually vacate. Then they all get given to the buyers. So I usually do check that box. Other items included in this agreement shall be provided at the end of the term of the seller license to remain in possession. Assignment or subletting. There's no assigning or subletting this term. Insurance, seller's personal property, including vehicles, is not being insured by the buyer. Not right. So sellers advised to get their own insurance. The waiver or breach shall not be construed as containing a waiver of the same or any subsequent breach. And then other terms and conditions. So there we go. And then everybody signs it. Any other questions about that form? All right, fabulous. Look, it's only 10:02. This form didn't take nearly as long as I thought it was going to. All right, so we covered today our SIP form, our SIPA form, which is the advisory, and then our SPRP. We will be back next week covering more seller forms. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out, and thanks for joining me today.